There are moments in life that stay with you, not because they were loud or violent or even particularly dramatic on the surface, but because something about them felt wrong in a way your gut understood before your brain caught up. I've been a palace footman for 11 years. I've served at state banquets. I've stood in hallways while heads of state whispered things to each other that I was paid, in a very real sense, never to have heard. I know how to be invisible. I know how to look at a wall and see nothing. That's the job. That's always been the job. But what I saw that Tuesday morning in late October, that's not something I can unsee. And I think about it almost every single day. Let me start from the beginning, because if I just tell you the end, you won't believe me. And I need you to believe me, because I was there. The morning started the way most October mornings do inside those walls. Cold, gray, and very, very quiet. There's a particular quality to the silence inside a royal residence when the main family isn't in residence. It's not the same as an empty building. It's deeper than that. The chandeliers are still lit. The carpets are still freshly vacuumed. The silver is still polished. But the people, the ones who give the place its heartbeat, are gone, and the whole building seems to know it. This particular residence, I won't give you the precise name, you'll understand why in a moment, had been quiet for about 10 days. The primary family was traveling. State duties, a Commonwealth visit, the usual calendar that takes the royals away from home more often than most people realize. That meant skeleton staff, a reduced protection detail, a handful of housekeeping personnel, 2 footmen, myself, and a younger man named Gerald who had only been with the household for about 14 months. And a rotating watch of royal protection officers stationed at key points throughout the building. The vault corridor was one of those points. Now I should explain what the vault is, or at least, what those of us who worked in that building understood it to be. It wasn't labeled. There was no sign. There was no dramatic steel door with a combination lock, nothing that looked like a bank. To a visitor who had somehow found themselves in that particular corridor, which wouldn't have happened because that corridor was never on any tour route, it would have looked like a very ordinary door. Dark wood, brass handle, a keypad on the wall to one side, tucked slightly behind the frame so you wouldn't notice it unless you already knew to look. But behind that door was the collection. Historical pieces, ceremonial jewels, items that had been in the family for generations, some of them centuries, pieces that had names, pieces that had their own entries in historical archives, the kind of objects that, if they were in a museum, would have their own room, their own lighting, their own climate-controlled case. Access to that corridor was restricted, and access to that room was very restricted. I had worked in that building for 4 years, and I had never been inside it. Most of the household staff hadn't. You didn't need to be, and you didn't ask. The protection officer stationed on the vault corridor that morning was a man I'll call Sergeant Doyle. That's not his real name, but it suits him, I think. He was the kind of man who looked like his name should be Doyle, broad through the shoulders, quiet in the way that wasn't unfriendly, just contained. He'd been with the Protection Command for over 15 years, the kind of officer who didn't need to speak much because everything about how he stood and where he looked communicated exactly what he needed it to. I'd spoken to him dozens of times over the years. Brief exchanges, morning greetings, a nod in a corridor. He was never rude, but he was always watchful. Even in casual conversation, part of him was always on the job. I respected that about him. I still do. That morning, I was on early rounds. My job was simple. Walk the residential wings, check that nothing had been disturbed overnight, report anything unusual to the head of household, and then prepare the morning room for the staff briefing at 8:30. I had just come around the corner that leads into the service corridor, the long, narrow one that runs parallel to the formal hallway, when I heard something that made me stop. A voice, low but urgent, not panicked, not shouting, but the kind of voice a person uses when they're trying to communicate something serious without making noise. I pressed myself slightly against the wall, not dramatically, not hiding exactly, but slowing my steps in that way you do when you're not sure what you're walking into. And then I heard it again. "Ma'am, that shouldn't be in your hands. Ma'am, I need you to put it back." I went very still, because I recognized the voice. It was Doyle's, and I recognized the weight in it. That careful, controlled authority that protection officers use when they need to assert command without causing a scene. When they're managing something that could become a situation, and they are trying, very deliberately, to make sure it doesn't. There was a pause. Silence from the other side of whatever door or corner this was happening behind. Then Doyle again, firmer this time. And this is the part I've replayed in my head probably 200 times since. Ma'am, with the greatest respect, that item cannot leave this room. I need you to place it back in the case. Now. Not shouting, not aggressive, but final. The way a man speaks when he's prepared to stand between what he's protecting and whatever comes next, regardless of who's standing in front of him. I didn't move, I barely breathed. I was about 4 feet from the corner that opened into the formal corridor. I could hear, but I couldn't see. And I was having a very serious conversation with myself about whether to step forward or quietly retreat the way I'd come. I chose neither. I stayed where I was and I listened, which I suspect makes me complicit in something, though I've never been entirely sure what. What I heard next was a voice I recognized. I want to be careful here. I want to be very precise about what I mean when I say I recognized it, because recognized is not the same as certain. It was enough to make my stomach drop. It was enough to make the hairs on my arms stand up. But I was 4 feet from a corner, speaking through walls and doorways, and I am not a court of law, and I am not making a sworn statement. What I can tell you is what I heard. A woman's voice, composed. The kind of composed that isn't natural, that's learned, the kind of composure that comes from decades of knowing that your reactions are always being watched. And the words were, I was only looking at it, I wasn't going to take it anywhere. Quiet, measured, and underneath it, something that I can only describe as caught. Not guilty exactly, but caught. Doyle's response came immediately. I understand, ma'am, but I need it placed back in the case, and then I need you to come with me. The duty officer needs to be informed. A pause. Then that's protocol, I'm sorry. I don't have discretion on this. Now let me tell you something about that sentence. I don't have discretion on this. That sentence in the world I work in is enormous. Because the entire culture of royal service, the whole architecture of it is built on discretion, on not seeing things, on not knowing things you technically know, on the understanding, unspoken and absolute, that the people who work in these buildings extend a form of professional grace to the family they serve. A grace that allows certain things to remain private, certain moments to stay unrecorded. When an officer says, I don't have discretion on this, it means whatever just happened is outside that grace. It means the rules are firm enough that no amount of relationship, no amount of loyalty, no amount of instinct to protect and smooth over, none of it applies. Whatever Doyle had just witnessed, he had decided, in real time, under enormous pressure, that it was beyond his ability to quietly manage. That decision, I thought then, and I still think now, must have cost him something. I heard footsteps. The soft click of something, a case closing, I imagined. Then the quiet beep of the keypad as the room was being secured. I made a decision. I turned and walked back the way I'd come, quickly but without running, and I went straight to the service stairs and down to the kitchen corridor. I didn't speak to anyone for about 20 minutes. I stood by the kettle, and I made a cup of tea I didn't really want, and I stared at the window above the sink that looked out over the rear courtyard, where the morning light was just beginning to break through the gray. And I thought about what loyalty means. Gerald found me there about 20 minutes later. He was carrying a clipboard, morning inventory, routine stuff, and he looked at me the way young staff look at older ones when something in the atmosphere has shifted, and they can't tell what it is yet. You all right, he said. Fine, I said. He stood beside me for a moment. He poured his own tea. Saw Doyle in the corridor, he said after a bit. He looked off like something had happened. I didn't respond. Did something happen? Gerald asked. I looked at him. He was 26, 27 maybe. Good kid. Earnest. The kind of person who still thought that knowing things was the same as being equipped to handle them. Drink your tea, I said, and don't ask questions you don't need answers to yet. He looked at me for a moment longer. Then he nodded and turned back to his clipboard. That was the end of part one of what I witnessed. But it was nowhere near the end of the story. By 9 in the morning, the building had changed. I don't know how else to describe it. Nothing was visibly different. The corridors were the same. The light coming through the tall windows was the same pale October gray. The housekeeping team were moving through their routines with the same quiet efficiency they always did. But something in the air was different. The way it feels before a storm, when the pressure drops and the birds go quiet, and your body registers what your eyes haven't processed yet. The duty officer, a man named Prescott, senior, careful, about 3 years from retirement, had arrived on the corridor. That much I knew because I saw him crossing the main hall at around 8:50, which was unusual. Prescott's normal route didn't take him through the main hall at that hour. He was a back corridor man. Service stairs, staff passages. If he was walking through the formal hall, he was walking to somewhere specific, and he was moving with purpose. I noted it, I said nothing. The staff briefing at 8:30 had been clipped. Brief. The head of household, a woman named Mrs. Calloway, who had been running household operations for longer than most of the staff had been alive, had gone through the morning schedule in her usual precise fashion, and then had closed with something she almost never said. I'd ask everyone today to please focus on your assigned areas and not venture into the East Wing corridors unless your duties specifically require it. Thank you. She moved on immediately. No explanation, no elaboration. The kind of sentence that was designed to close a door rather than open one. Gerald glanced at me from across the table. I looked at my notepad. The thing about working in an environment like that, any highly controlled, highly formal institutional environment, is that you become extraordinarily good at reading the unspoken. You develop a kind of fluency in what isn't being said, the pause before an answer, the way someone arranges their expression when they're controlling it, the topics that are mentioned and then smoothly redirected, the names that don't come up in conversations where they logically should. By 11 that morning, I was fairly certain of 3 things. 1, whatever had happened in the vault corridor had been escalated. Not to the press, not to any external body, at least not yet, but internally through the chain that exists in these institutions for exactly these situations. Quiet chains, careful chains. Chains that move information upward without leaving a paper trail that goes sideways. 2, Doyle had been removed from his post for the day. I didn't see him once after that morning. His usual spot on the corridor was covered by a younger officer I didn't recognize, new placement, probably brought in on short notice. 3, whatever the item was, the thing Doyle had told someone to put back, it mattered. It wasn't a trinket. It wasn't something that could be explained away or quietly forgotten. Because the level of response, Prescott's presence, Mrs. Calloway's instruction, the shift in the building's atmosphere, all of that was proportional. And in my experience, institutional responses are almost always proportional to the actual severity of what they're responding to. Something significant had almost happened. Or perhaps something significant had happened, and what was being managed now was the aftermath. I want to talk about Doyle for a moment, because I think he deserves that. Because what he did that morning, what I heard him do, through a wall, in a corridor, in a situation that most people in his position would have been tempted to quietly overlook, was one of the most remarkable acts of professional integrity I've ever witnessed. Think about what he was faced with. He was a protection officer. His entire career had been built in service of the institution and the people within it. The relationship between a protection officer and the family they serve is one of the most particular professional relationships that exists. It's built on trust, on discretion, on an almost unspoken mutual understanding that the officer sees things and the officer does not speak of them, and in return the officer is trusted absolutely. And in that moment, he had to choose between 2 versions of that trust. There was the version of trust that says, protect the people, and protecting them means protecting their privacy, their reputation, their ability to move through the world without institutional consequence. And there was the version of trust that says, protect the institution, protect what has been entrusted to your watch, and do not let anything be removed from where it belongs regardless of who is holding it. He chose the second. In that single sentence, I don't have discretion on this. He chose the institution over the individual. The protocol over the relationship. The thing that was harder over the thing that would have been easier and probably never spoken of again. That's not a small thing. That's not a thing that happens automatically. That's a decision a man makes in real time under pressure, knowing that the consequences might follow him. I have enormous respect for that. The afternoon was quiet in the way that afternoons in those buildings sometimes are, a kind of enforced normalcy, everyone performing their routines with slightly too much attention. Around 3 o'clock, I was in the silver pantry doing inventory, genuinely routine, nothing to do with any of this, when Mrs. Calloway appeared in the doorway. She didn't come in. She stood at the threshold, which was a thing she did when she needed to speak to someone briefly without the conversation becoming a longer thing than she intended it to be. "How are you getting on?" she asked. "Fine, Mrs. Calloway, just the usual." She nodded. She looked at the silver briefly without really seeing it. Then she said very quietly, "You know, in a house like this, the most valuable thing a member of staff can possess isn't skill or discretion or even loyalty." I waited. It's the understanding that some mornings simply don't require a record. She held my gaze for just a moment. "Carry on," she said. And she was gone. I understood what she was telling me. I understood it completely. And I want to be honest with you about my reaction to it, because I think honesty is the only thing I can offer here that has any real value. My immediate reaction was to accept it, to nod inside myself and go back to the silver and let the morning become exactly what she was describing, an unrecorded thing. Because that's the culture, that's how it works, that's how it's always worked, and not entirely without reason. Because institutions like this one operate on a kind of protective silence that isn't always sinister. Sometimes it protects genuine privacy. Sometimes it protects people from the distortion that public exposure inevitably creates. Sometimes the silence is a form of grace. But here's the thing I kept coming back to. Doyle hadn't chosen silence. Doyle had been right there, closer than I was, facing the situation directly with more to lose than I had, and he had chosen the other thing. He had said, "I don't have discretion on this." He had said, "Put it back." He had said, "The duty officer needs to be informed." And now I was being gently, kindly, professionally invited to let that choice disappear into the silence around it. I wasn't sure how I felt about that. I'm still not sure, honestly. Gerald found me again just before 5, as the afternoon shift was winding down. He looked like he'd been carrying something all day. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Depends on the question," I said. He glanced over his shoulder. The pantry was empty except for us. "Did something happen this morning? Something I don't know. Something bigger than what people are saying." "What are people saying?" I asked. He shrugged. "Nothing, that's the thing, nobody's saying anything. And that feels, I don't know how to explain it, it feels louder than usual, the nothing." I looked at him for a long moment. He was right, of course. The silence was loud. It had been loud all day. "Gerald," I said, "how long have you been here?" 14 months, he said. "All right, then let me tell you something that nobody told me when I started, and that I wish they had." He waited. "In a place like this," I said, "there are things that happen that you will witness, and some of those things will make you want to understand them, to place them in a frame, to make sense of what you saw and what it means. And the impulse to do that, to know, is a very human impulse, and there's nothing wrong with it." He nodded. "But the question you have to ask yourself every time is, who does the knowing serve? Is it the people involved? Is it the institution? Is it you and your need to make sense of the world? Or is it nobody? Is it just information existing in a space where it wasn't supposed to be?" He was quiet for a moment. "What did you see?" he asked. "I didn't see anything," I said. "I heard something, and what I heard was a good man doing exactly what he was supposed to do." I picked up my clipboard. "That's enough," I said. "For today, that's enough." 2 weeks passed. The building came back to life. The family returned, the full staff resumed, the corridors filled with the particular energy that comes when a royal residence is genuinely occupied. The state rooms were opened. The morning briefings lengthened. The protective detail doubled. Doyle came back to his post. I saw him on a Thursday morning back in his usual corridor, standing in his usual way. Same posture, same contained watchfulness, same quiet authority. We didn't speak. We passed each other in a corridor near the service entrance, and we exchanged the nod that people who work in the same building exchange every day. The nod that says, "I see you," without requiring anything more than that. But something was different. I noticed it, and I think he noticed that I noticed it, and we both pretended otherwise. He was standing differently. Not physically, his posture was exactly the same, but the way he occupied space. The way his eyes moved when people walked past him. There was something in him that had been tested and had come through the other side, and things that come through the other side of being tested are never entirely the same afterward. He'd made a hard call, in real time, alone, with no manual for the specific situation he was facing. He had made the harder of two possible choices, and he had lived in the aftermath of that for 2 weeks, and now he was back. I respected that more than I can easily say. 3 days after Doyle returned, I was summoned to the office of the household's senior administrator, a man named Hutchings, who managed the formal operations side of things, compliance, records, that sort of domain. I wasn't alarmed. Summons to Hutchings' office were not infrequent. He was a detail man, the kind of administrator who followed up on things as a matter of course. But when I sat down across from him, and he closed the folder on his desk with a particular kind of deliberateness, I understood that this wasn't routine. "You've been here 11 years, he said. "That's right. You have an excellent record." I nodded. He folded his hands. "I'm not here to ask you anything specific. I want to be very clear about that. I'm simply here to make sure you understand something." I waited. What happened on the morning of the 14th was reviewed at the highest appropriate level within the household. The matter was handled. Protocols were followed. Corrections were made. I said nothing. "There was no breach," he said. "I want to be precise about that. The item was secured. It did not leave the room. It did not leave the building. Everything is where it is supposed to be." He looked at me steadily. "The officer who intervened conducted himself with complete correctness. He will face no adverse consequence. In fact, the opposite." Something loosened in my chest when he said that. I hadn't realized until that moment how much I'd been holding. "I'm glad," I said, and I meant it. Hutchings nodded. The household values loyalty in many forms, including the form that looks like saying nothing. He stood. The meeting was over. "That will be all," he said. "Thank you for your service." I've thought about that conversation many times since. The item was secured. It did not leave the room. That sentence is the one I keep returning to, because it tells you everything about what mattered to the people at the top of that response chain, not the who, not the why, not the how it began or what led to it. What mattered was the outcome. The object was where it was supposed to be. The line had held. And the reason the line had held was a man named Doyle, who stood in a corridor early on an October morning and chose, with no time to think and no colleague to consult, to do the exact right thing. Let me tell you about the jewels themselves, not their specific identities, but what they represent. Because I think that's the part that people miss when they hear a story like this. These aren't just valuable objects. They're not just old things made of precious materials that could be sold for money. They're history. They're the physical record of generations. They carry the fingerprints of people who have been dead for centuries. They've been worn at moments that shaped the world: coronations, treaties, funerals, weddings. They've crossed oceans. They've survived wars. They've been hidden during occupations and reclaimed after liberation. They exist in a dimension of time that most objects don't reach, and their presence in that vault is the continuation of an unbroken chain of custodianship that goes back further than most of us can meaningfully imagine. When Doyle said "put it back," he wasn't just enforcing a procedural rule about where objects should be stored. He was saying, "This is not yours to take, not because of what it's worth, but because of what it is, because of what it carries, because of the weight of what it means, and because I have been entrusted with the continuation of something that was here before both of us and will be here after both of us, and I will not let that continuity break. Not on my watch, not today." That's a big thing to say in a corridor, alone, to someone whose title and position and presence in that building carried an enormous gravitational pull. But he said it, and he meant it, and the line held. I left the building for the last time about 8 months after that morning. Not because of anything connected to those events, My reasons were my own, personal, domestic, the usual shifting of life. 11 years was a long time, and I was ready for something different. On my last day, I was doing the final rounds of the building that had been my workplace for more than a decade, saying the quiet goodbyes that you say in places like that, formal on the surface, loaded underneath. I passed through the service corridor, the long, narrow one that runs parallel to the formal hall. The one I'd been standing in on that October morning, listening through the wall. I stopped for a moment. The corridor was empty. The walls were plain painted white, slightly worn at shoulder height where staff had leaned against them for generations. The fluorescent light above hummed faintly. It smelled of cleaning fluid and old wood, and the particular smell of institutional buildings that is somehow the same in every country, every context. An ordinary corridor. The kind of place where nothing important ever happens. Except that something important had happened there. A man had stood in a room a few feet from where I was standing, and he had looked at a person holding something that didn't belong to them, and he had said, quietly, firmly, without flinching, "Put it back. I've been out of that world for some time now. I live differently, I work differently. The mornings are slower and the silences are my own. But I think about Doyle. I think about that corridor. I think about the particular quality of moral courage that isn't dramatic, that doesn't come with a soundtrack or a crowd or any of the external scaffolding we usually associate with bravery. The courage that is quiet, that happens in a room with only 2 or 3 people in it. That is never acknowledged publicly and never put in a press release and never added to anyone's public record. The courage that is just a man doing his job exactly right, when it would have been so much easier not to. There is a question I get asked sometimes by people who know I worked in that world. Was it worth it, 11 years of seeing things and saying nothing? And I always say the same thing. I saw something once that was worth all of it. A guard who could have looked the other way. And didn't. The jewels are still there. Behind that plain door, behind that quiet keypad, in the corridor that nobody visits and nobody talks about. The chain is unbroken. The line held. And somewhere, I hope, a man named Doyle still stands at his post, still watches, still carries the particular weight of knowing what it cost him to do the right thing and having done it anyway. That's not nothing. In fact, I think that might be everything.